I was commissioned by a customer to do a little bit of body work to this Jaguar XJS and also paint it for him in the Tom Walkinshaw racing livery. He already did a couple of bits of work to the body, cutting out a couple of holes that needed to be there for some of the specific parts that will be added on later, and I also still needed to modify a couple of pieces around the window trim, some parts that needed to be removed on the body and also on the hood, generally just clean it up and prepare it for paint. So first of all, I just started removing all of the pieces that did not need to be there. On the hood there was a Jaguar logo that isn't there on the race car. Some of the indicators on the front and also the modifications to the window trim were then taken care of. During a quick test fit with the hood, I noticed that it was really tight, so it needed to be sanded down a little bit so it was easier to fit in. Specifically, after a couple of coats of paint, this would never have fit back in place, so sanding it down gives it a bit more room. When looking at some of the reference photos, the main windshield frame, or rubber in this case, is pretty much incorrect all round. It is missing the entire panel line on the bottom half, on the side, and also on the top there is just a small indentation, and that's pretty much it. And there is a piece of extra trim that doesn't need to be there, so that simply needs to be removed. I took out a permanent marker just to mark off what needed to be done and then went to work. In order to add the panel lines that were missing, I simply took out a super sharp knife and scribed the first line and then made them a bit deeper with my Panelline scribers later on. The window rubber around the front, specifically in the top corners, needs to be rounded off on both the side one for the side doors or the doors and the one for around the windshield, so I needed to remove a little bit of material, as the kit just made it one piece straight through onto the next panel line and did not have that sort of triangle removed and flattened out to make it level with the rest of the roof. Now once that was taken care of for this stage, I could move on to scribing out all of the panel lines that weren't there, make them nice and deep, and also went over all of the other panel lines that were already there but just simply needed to be a bit deeper. The mold lines on the body were also marked with a permanent marker to show me where they were and then removed with some sandpaper. In order to get the rest of the body ready for paint, I needed to sand it down, and that is done with a 600 grit. In the past, I have had terrible luck with these Hasegawa plastics and also have heard of friends using lacquer paints like I am that it could be incredibly aggressive on these types of plastic that Hasegawa is using, and therefore I decided to use a 2K primer just to seal it all in, so it saves me a bit of stress for the rest of the paint layers to go on top of it and doesn't make any nasty reactions with the rest of the bodywork. So sealing it in with a couple of coats was my first task. A couple coats of 2K primer and a couple of hours of cure time later, it is dry enough to move on to the next step, and that is correcting what I have done before. Now the panel lines I have been scribing out a little more than I should, so some panel lines have been created that shouldn't be there. Those need to be filled up with a bit of filler, and I also went over all of the changes and modifications I made to the window, rubbers and frames to correct them a bit more and finalize a bit of the rougher work. I then filled it in with some UV curing putty from Tamiya, added some UV light to make it cure, sanded it smooth, and moved on to the next stage, which was just regular primer. Since I'm going to be painting the stripes on, I'm going for a white primer, and then applying the white paint. A couple coats of white primer have been applied, no more mistakes are found in the bodywork, and I can move on to applying the white paint. Now, since I'm going to be painting the white stripe only, I'm just applying the paint where it needs to be and not going for an entire coat on the rest of the body as well, as that will need to be painted green further on. The white was then left to cure overnight, and I could move on masking the stripe off the next day. First of all, I'm going to add a sacrificial piece of tape just to line out the bottom of where the stripe needs to be, and I could then custom cut a super thin strip of masking tape, as the masking tape that I had wasn't thin enough for this stripe, and started applying that along that sacrificial piece that I applied earlier. With the first permanent stripe now laid down, I could remove that sacrificial piece and start on the rest of the masking. So the first stripe on the bottom that I applied earlier has to stay white, and then in between that and the next white stripe needs to be a bit of green. So I applied another bit of masking tape, but then slightly higher, just leaving a bit of the white exposed for the green paint to fill that in and create that second stripe. The front wheel arch needed to stay green, so that simply just needed to be cut in the sort of gap or groove that is there very carefully, and then removing the masking and then painting that green later on with the rest of the exposed bodywork. A couple hours later, after masking all of the other pieces off as well, including the other side mirroring what I have shown, I could move on to applying the green in various light coats until it was fully covered. A couple coats of green later, and then I could remove the masking tape. The body is fully covered and still a little bit wet. It is dry to the touch generally, but I still don't really want to touch the green, so I'm just very carefully removing only the masking tape. With all of the tape removed and no major faults found, I could just simply let it cure for a little longer before applying a couple coats of clear. I want this body to be nice and glossy and also to be covered super smoothly all over to give it a nice finish. About 3 coats of clear later, and I was happy with the way that the clear laid down, so I could set it aside to cure for a bit before moving on to the next and final stage for me on this build, and that is to do the window trim. The body has had enough time to cure, so I could mask it all off in order to paint all of the flat back areas around the window trim for the front and the side. A couple coats of flat black later and I could start unmasking. On the side trim for the rubber, there is a small strip of chrome that needs to be applied, and also on that last upright strip there is a bit of chrome that needs to be applied as well. I'm putting down a small piece of sacrificial tape that does not really help the chrome foil stick to it, but it does help as a little bit of a guide and also makes it super easy to remove the excess after cutting it off. With the excess chrome and tape now removed, a couple more strips needs to be applied here and there and then copied on the other side as well before finishing my section of the work off. So just to be clear, I'm not going to be building this kit. I just did the body and paint work for the customer and he is going to be finishing it off himself. So this will be left to cure fully for a couple of days before packing it up and shipping it over to the customer.